Tonight we'll drift into a most peculiar corner of history, one where steam curls through dim bathhouses, the wooden floors creak softly, and Victorian gentlemen somehow manage the delicate art of washing without ever meeting each other's gaze. It's not scandalous, nor especially glamorous, but perhaps that's exactly what makes it perfect for sleep. So, dim your lights, settle under your blanket, maybe let the cool edge of your pillow touch your cheek, let your shoulders drop just a little more, and as we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there, in your quiet corner? If this calm journey helps you unwind, tap like and subscribe. Only if it feels right, of course. No rush, no fuss. We have a long, gentle road ahead. And now, let's step into the steam. Let me tell you about the sound of a towel in 1887. Not the crisp industrial crack of modern hotel linen, but the slow, softened flap of cotton that's been washed so many times it carries the shape of the hands that used it. In the grand bathing establishments of late Victorian London, towels were an unspoken language. Handing one to another man required neither eye contact nor words, just a polite, almost choreographed motion, as though they were passing a folded note in church. The bathhouse itself smelled faintly of coal smoke and eucalyptus, not because eucalyptus was fashionable, but because a certain Mr. Alderman at the front desk had taken to boiling leaves in a pot over the stove to purify the lungs, a practice he'd read about in a South Australian agricultural journal. I imagine you can hear the floorboards sighing under the weight of polished boots, each step softened by the moist air, and over it all, a soft hum. Not music exactly, but the rhythmic patter of water falling from copper spouts into marble basins. Here's the curious thing. By the 1880s, the public bath movement had reached even the quieter neighbourhoods of London, and etiquette had evolved into an art form. Looking another man in the eyes while he was adjusting his bathing drawers was simply not done. Instead, one's gaze was to rest on neutral points. A wall sconce, the trim of a towel, the middle distance where steam curled like thought itself. You might wonder, how did this start? Why such disciplined avoidance? Well, there's no one date you can pin to the custom, but the London Times did publish, on the 4th of March 1883, a short note describing the admirable reserve shown by gentlemen of the South Bank Bath in respecting the visual privacy of their fellows. It was both an observation and, in a way, a public reminder. Eye contact was too intimate for these damp, tiled realms. Imagine stepping into that space. Your boots set aside, your coat hung on a peg with a little brass number. A bath attendant wearing an apron that had once been white but was now permanently tea-coloured offers you a folded towel without looking up from his ledger. The towel is warm, almost as if it's been resting on a radiator, though in truth it's just fresh from a press heated by coal. You take it with a small nod and step towards the curtained stool where warm water waits. And that water, oh, that first touch, is not scalding nor tepid, but something in between, like slipping your hands into a bowl of porridge left to cool just enough for breakfast. You let the heat move slowly up your arms, loosening something in the muscles of your neck. You hear the faint squeak of another man adjusting a tap nearby, and you instinctively glance toward the noise. But of course you check yourself, letting your gaze rest on the shining brass pipe instead. It's almost comical in a gentle way, this mutual agreement to behave like portraits hung on opposite walls, each aware of the other, yet fixed in separate directions. The unspoken rule works so well that occasional breaches, like the time Mr. Fairfax accidentally met eyes with a solicitor from Highgate while both were reaching for soap, would become whispered legends among the regular patrons. Soap, by the way, was an entirely different affair from our perfumed modern bars. Thick, pale and faintly gritty, it smelled of lye and faint lavender, the kind of scent that lingers on your hands for hours and makes you think of laundry lines strung across tiny yards. Some patrons swore that the grit was crushed oyster shell for a man's proper exfoliation, though it was more likely just unrefined tallow. And so you bathe slowly, the steam wrapping around you like a ghostly shawl. Every movement is unhurried, every sound softened by water. You feel the slick porcelain under your fingers, the little rivulets that cling to your skin before falling away. You could close your eyes here and still see it all in your mind. The faint shadows of other men moving quietly, the occasional cough, the muffled clink of a basin being set down. When you've finished, you step out and wrap the towel around yourself in a practiced motion. The fabric is thin but somehow enough, holding just the right amount of warmth. Another man passes by, his gaze carefully set toward the ceiling beams, and you both share the smallest of nods, an acknowledgement that you have both completed this strange silent ritual exactly as tradition demands. You return the towel to a wicker basket where it lands with a muffled thud and slip back into your clothes. The wool waistcoat just a little snug from last winter's Christmas pudding, the cuffs smelling faintly of the street outside. And as you step out into the brisk London night, you feel a certain stillness. Not the thrill of adventure nor the drama of gossip, just the quiet, enduring satisfaction of having been part of something so small, so unremarkable, that it may last forever in the shadows of history. And as we leave that warm bathhouse behind, let your mind wander to the scent of fresh bread drifting through the cool air. For where we go next, there are other small customs to explore. Now, just across the street from that respectable bathhouse, the one with the eucalyptus kettle and the creaky floorboards, there's a little bakery. Not the grand sort with gold-lettered signage, but a squat brick front shop with a window so fogged from the ovens inside that you could draw shapes with your finger in the glass. I often think it must have been a mercy for the bathhouse patrons, stepping from the warm, damp air into the crisp night, only to have the scent of baking bread tug at their attention like a child pulling your sleeve. The smell didn't just float, it wrapped around you. Rich yeast, faint wood smoke, and the sweet trace of something buttery that wasn't quite a pastry and wasn't quite a loaf. If you were lucky, you might catch the baker's assistant propping open the back door for a delivery of flour. Sacks so large they could double as a sleeping mat for two. And if you lingered just a moment longer, perhaps pretending to fumble with your gloves, you'd hear the soft clatter of wooden paddles against oven stone and the hiss of water thrown into the chamber to make a perfect crust. The bread of 1880s London wasn't the pillowy supermarket kind we know. It had more weight to it, more character. Biting into it was a bit like shaking hands with a Victorian gentleman himself. Firm, steady, and just a touch rough from life's work. The outer crust had to be earned, cracked open with a decisive break, but inside was a soft, almost cake-like crumb that carried the heat of the oven, long after it was pulled from the peel. Sometimes, the baker would make small rolls known as cottage loaves, their peculiar double-tiered shape looking like a snowman who had decided to become bread. These were sold still warm, wrapped in a scrap of paper, which, if you were walking home from the bathhouse, made the perfect companion. Hands warmed by the bread, mind still drifting in the gentle fog of steam, it was easy to forget the damp cobbles beneath your boots. There's a story, though whether it's true I'll leave you to decide, that in 1885, a certain Mr. Gregory from the South Bank district took to buying a cottage loaf after every bath and carrying it home to his boarding house. One cold January night, he was spotted halfway across Waterloo Bridge with the loaf tucked inside his coat like a precious relic. When asked why he sheltered bread from the wind, he's said to have replied, "It's my loaf's first winter. It deserves a little kindness." And if that's not the sort of human warmth that deserves remembering, I don't know what is. Now, this bakery wasn't only about bread. In the back room, they kept a small copper pot for what the apprentices called pudding experiments. Victorian puddings could be anything from dense fruitcakes to sweet steamed creations, resembling sponge in both texture and affection. The one they made on Thursdays was treacle pudding, golden syrup mixed into a batter that steamed for hours until it could be sliced like a wedge of history. The first bite was sticky, almost heavy, but the second bite somehow lighter, the sweetness mellowing into comfort. I recall one record, a tiny advert in the Illustrated London News dated November the 17th, 1884, in which the bakery offered a penny slice of hot pudding with spoon to be enjoyed on premises. The spoon was returned naturally, but the warmth stayed with you. Can you imagine? Standing in a corner of that humble shop, steam rising from your bowl, listening to the soft drumbeat of rain on the roof. Not speaking, not rushing, just letting the treacle coat your spoon as if it had nowhere else to be. And the baker himself, a Mr. Kemp, was a man of very few words. Perhaps he'd spent all his breath stoking ovens for 3 decades. But every so often, when handing over a loaf, he'd meet your eyes for just the briefest second on a rare breach of the bathhouse code across the street. And there, in that flicker, you felt seen. So you'd leave with your bread or pudding, perhaps a thin paper bag crinkling softly in your hand, and walk slowly, the street lamps casting pools of amber light on the cobblestones. Your coat would smell faintly of flour now, the kind that clings and travels home with you like a polite stowaway. And maybe, just maybe, you'd think of the bathhouse again. The quiet towel exchanges, the steam, the silent nods, and feel grateful for both, the cleansing warmth of water and the sustaining warmth of bread. And as we drift away from that glowing little bakery window, let your mind follow the scent of something richer, spicier. For there's a tea house just a few streets away where another set of customs awaits us. If you follow the curling ribbon of warm spice through the damp evening streets, past the narrow alley where rainwater trickles in silver threads, past the green-painted door of the shoemaker who never quite finishes before midnight, you'll find it. A tea house so modest you could mistake it for someone's living room, if not for the carved sign above the door, its lettering softened by years of fog and drizzle. The bell above the door doesn't clang or jingle, but lets out a gentle ting, the kind of sound that makes you think of porcelain cups tapping together in a quiet toast. The moment you step in, you're wrapped in warmth. Not just from the hearth in the corner, but from the scent of cinnamon, cardamom, and something faintly citrus that drifts from the kitchen in slow waves. The lighting here is deliberate. Oil lamps on each table cast pools of gold just big enough to frame a cup and saucer. Beyond that, the rest of the room is shadows. Not unfriendly ones, but the kind that make you want to sit a little closer to the flame. Somewhere in the background you hear the soft scrape of a chair on wooden planks, the muffled clink of a teapot lid settling back into place. Now, the tea house had its own unwritten rules, just like the bathhouse. The most famous of these, though famous may be too grand a word for something only 20-odd regulars knew, was that the waiter, a young man named Arthur, never initiated conversation. He'd approach your table with eyes fixed on the space just above your shoulder, place your cup and pot with precision, and vanish again with the soundless efficiency of a particularly polite ghost. Arthur had been working there since 1882, the year he turned 16, though his presence felt much older, as though he'd been part of the furniture since the first brick was laid. There's a story, passed between patrons like a good joke, that once, during an especially crowded afternoon, a customer asked him directly, "Do you ever look at anyone?" Arthur, without missing a beat, poured their tea and replied, "Not without a written invitation, sir." The tea itself was unlike anything served in the city's grander establishments. Instead of the brisk, almost sharp black teas that dominated London tables, this house favoured blends softened with spices and sometimes sweetened with a spoon of thick amber honey. One particular favourite, first offered in October 1884, was known simply as Autumn Mix, a fragrant combination of Assam leaves, orange peel, and just enough clove to make the first sip feel like stepping into a room where someone has been baking for hours. The cups were mismatched, some fine porcelain with delicate blue patterns, others sturdy earthenware mugs with tiny chips at the rim. Each cup had its own quiet history, though you'd never hear it told. You'd have to imagine it between sips. And each pot came with a small plate of shortbread, thick crumbly pieces that dissolved almost as soon as they touched your tongue. I remember reading in a diary, belonging to a Mrs. Weatherby who lived 2 streets away, about her first visit to this tea house in November 1885. She wrote, "It is a place where even the air seems to whisper. The young man who serves the tea must be the very embodiment of restraint, yet I believe him to be kind, for the shortbread was arranged as if to please the eye as well as the mouth." Evenings here moved at the pace of the kettle. You could sit for an hour, your tea cooling in slow increments, and no one would rush you. Outside you'd hear the clip of hooves on stone, muffled by the thick windows, and the occasional distant whistle from the railway station. Inside, the loudest sound was the soft glug of tea being poured, followed by the faintest sigh of steam escaping from the spout. When you finished, Arthur would appear again as if summoned by thought alone, his gaze still politely elsewhere, and whisk away your cup. Payment was left on the table. Always exact change, never coins clinking into his palm. Then, with a nod that was neither hurried nor hesitant, he'd retreat into the half-light. Stepping back out into the London night, you'd carry the warmth of that tea with you, not just in your stomach, but in your fingers, your breath, and perhaps in your manner. For some time after, you might find yourself speaking more softly, or pausing before you answered a question, as though the tea house had lent you a small portion of its patience. And as we wander away from the glow of that doorway, let the trail of spice and honey fade behind us. Ahead, the faint sound of strings is waiting. For just a few streets away, there's a parlour where music is played so quietly it's almost part of the wallpaper. If you follow the faint ribbon of sound through the quiet side streets, past a row of shuttered shop fronts, past the old lamplighter's ladder leaning against a brick wall, you'll find it. A modest terraced house, its only outward clue a small card in the window that reads simply, "Music this evening." The door is painted a deep green, the kind of green that has seen years of rain, polish, and the occasional scratch from a restless cat. When you knock, the sound is almost swallowed by the soft music within, but a moment later the latch clicks and the door opens to a narrow hallway lit by a single gas sconce. Inside, the air is warm and faintly scented with beeswax polish. The floorboards creak underfoot, and somewhere, deeper in the house, a violin sings a note so long and steady it feels more like breath than sound. You follow the hallway until it opens into a parlour, the sort of room that seems to have been arranged for comfort first, appearances second. There's a small fire in the grate, its crackle blending with the delicate sweep of bow against string. Chairs are placed in a loose circle, none exactly matching, one with a carved back, another upholstered in a slightly faded floral pattern. The wallpaper is pale cream with climbing vines printed in a muted green, and in the corner stands a tall potted fern, its fronds brushing the ceiling. The musician, a gentleman in his middle years with silver streaking his hair, doesn't acknowledge new arrivals right away. His eyes are closed, his chin resting lightly on the violin, as though the music itself is the true host here. The piece he plays is not a famous one, no grand crescendos or familiar refrains. Instead, it drifts in soft curves, each note sliding into the next like footsteps in deep carpet. You find a chair and sink into it. The seat dips slightly, the cushion well worn from years of visitors. The room's warmth settles around you, the fire's heat on your shins, the faint smell of pine from the kindling. There's no applause here, no polite clearing of throats, just an unspoken agreement to let the music run its quiet course. Every so often, the violin is joined by a faint hum from the player himself, so low you can feel it more than hear it. And behind that, from somewhere in the kitchen, the gentle tick of a clock keeping its own steady tempo. On the low table in the centre of the room sits a plate of currant buns, not meant to be eaten mid-performance, but waiting as a reward for patience. Their tops are glazed to a soft shine, the fruit peeking out here and there like little constellations. I once read in a small concert programme from 1886 that this parlour offers both a feast for the ear and afterward a modest comfort for the palate. That much I can confirm. When the music finally comes to rest, not with a sharp finish, but with a note that seems to wander off into the air, the room stays still for a moment longer. Then the musician opens his eyes, offers a small nod, and gestures toward the table. Conversation begins in low tones, like water running in the next room. The currant buns are soft, still faintly warm, their sweetness balanced by the little bursts of tart fruit. You eat slowly, breaking off small pieces, letting the fire and the last of the music settle deep into you. The musician joins you at the table, not to talk about his playing, but to remark on the weather, or a neighbour's new puppy, or the curious fact that currants were once taxed differently than raisins. It's true. In 1873, Parliament debated the matter for nearly an hour. And just when you think the evening is done, the violin finds its way into his hands again, almost by accident, and another soft tune begins. This one even slower, as though it's meant to carry you home without your feet quite touching the ground. When you leave, the air outside feels cooler, sharper, but the warmth of that parlour lingers like a shawl draped over your shoulders. And as you walk, the music follows, not loudly, but in the way a scent can cling to your coat. And as we move further into the night, let your mind follow the sound of something else entirely, the steady bubbling of a kettle, far down a narrow lane, where a modest soup shop serves warmth in a bowl. If you follow the lane where the cobblestones tilt just enough to collect tiny puddles, you'll come upon it. A soup shop so small you could almost miss it if not for the steady curl of steam rising from a vent above the door. The sign outside is nothing more than painted letters on wood. Hot broth and stew, Est 1879. The paint is faded, the wood a little warped, but the letters have a quiet certainty about them. The door is always slightly ajar, letting the scent spill into the street. It's not a sharp smell, but a deep one, like wool soaked in warm herbs, or a Sunday kitchen that's been simmering since morning. Inside, the air is thick with the mingling aromas of barley, onions, and something faintly peppery that prickles the back of your throat in the most comforting way. The shop is just one room, with a long wooden counter at the back where 3 great pots are kept over low flame. Behind the counter stands Mrs. Whittaker, a woman who has been here so long her apron seems as permanent as her smile. She greets you not with words, but with a tilt of a ladle and a raised eyebrow that says, "The usual." You nod, and the ladle sinks into the nearest pot with a soft plop, emerging with a scoop of golden broth thickened with pearl barley. Into a wide, shallow bowl it goes, followed by 2 neat slices of bread set alongside. Bread that, I suspect, has walked over from the bakery we passed earlier in our wanderings. The steam rises in soft, swirling layers, carrying with it the faint memory of leeks, thyme, and perhaps a whisper of chicken that's given all its goodness to the pot. The first spoonful is never too hot. Mrs. Whittaker knows exactly when to serve it, and as it slips across your tongue you feel warmth blooming in your chest and fingertips alike. Every table here is small enough that you can hear the other patrons without ever having to join in. There's a man in the corner reading a newspaper, the pages rustling in slow, careful turns. Beside the window, a pair of women share a bowl between them, passing the spoon back and forth as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The bread, when you tear it, has that faint resistance before the crumb yields, the mark of a loaf baked to last the day. Dipping it into the broth softens it instantly, and when you bite down, the flavour is like catching the very essence of the soup in one small mouthful. On the wall above the counter hangs a framed clipping from the Morning Advertiser, dated March 2nd, 1881. It praises Mrs. Whittaker's ability to provide a sustaining meal for the working man at a most reasonable rate. Below it, a handwritten note, done in a tidy script that could only be hers, reads, "All are welcome, not only the working man." Every so often the door opens, letting in a gust of cool air and a new scent. Damp coats, wet wool, the faint tang of fog. It mingles with the soup's perfume before fading into the background. No one rushes to close the door. It's simply part of the rhythm here. By the time you've scraped the last spoonful from the bowl, your shoulders have dropped a little lower. Your breaths have grown slower. The warmth is no longer just in your hands. It's settled in that deep, steady way that makes the night air outside seem less a chill and more an invitation to stroll. Mrs. Whittaker takes your bowl with the same nod she greeted you with, as if to say, "You've done well." And as you step back into the lane, the steam follows you for a few steps, as though reluctant to let you go. And just ahead, where the lane bends, there's the faint clink of glass, a signal that the tavern is still open, and that perhaps, just perhaps, there's one more warm corner waiting before the night is through. At the bend in the lane, the light comes first, a buttery, flickering glow spilling from windows so old their glass has gone a little wavy. Then comes the sound, a low hum of voices, the occasional scrape of a chair, and the muffled thud of a tankard being set down on wood. The tavern sign swings gently above the door, its painted image of a fox barely visible in the lamplight. The moment you push the door open, a wash of warmth meets you. Not just heat from the hearth, but the unmistakable welcome of a room well worn by laughter, spilled ale, and stories told too many times to count. The air smells faintly of malt and roasting chestnuts, the latter being turned on a small grate near the fire by a boy barely tall enough to see over the counter. The tavern isn't large. A few tables huddle near the fireplace, their edges shiny from years of elbows and tankards. On the far wall, a shelf holds mismatched mugs, some pewter, some plain pottery, each claimed by a regular. If you listen carefully, you might hear someone remark, "Mind my mug," as they pass, not because it's valuable, but because it's theirs. Now, there's a particular custom here, one I've never seen elsewhere. When a patron arrives late in the evening, after most conversations have settled into a low, comfortable murmur, the regulars offer what's called the silent toast. A raised glass, no clinking, no words, just a small nod and a look that says, "We see you, welcome." It's a quiet sort of belonging. You make your way to the bar where the innkeeper, a tall man with a beard that could pass for a scarf, pours you a pint without asking what you'll have. The ale is dark, almost black in the dim light, with a thin cap of foam that smells faintly of coffee and caramel. The first sip is cool, the bitterness rolling in slowly before fading into a faint sweetness that lingers on the tongue. By the fire, the chestnuts pop gently in their pan, each one releasing a little burst of earthy aroma. The boy tending them occasionally shakes the grate, the sound a soft rattle beneath the deeper notes of conversation. Every now and then someone drops a coin into a battered tin on the bar, payment for a handful of chestnuts when they're ready. The regulars sit in familiar groups. Two men playing cribbage with cards so worn you can barely see the suits. A trio of women sharing a jug of cider. A solitary man in a bowler hat who stares into the fire as if it's telling him something only he can hear. On the far wall hangs a yellowed notice from 1878, warning patrons that rowdiness will not be tolerated. Judging by the calm, almost drowsy air in the room, the rule has long been kept, or perhaps the very spirit of the place discourages anything louder than a hearty laugh. Your pint is half gone before the chestnuts arrive, tipped into a small paper cone. The shells are warm to the touch, and when you split one open, the nut inside is soft, sweet, and just a little smoky from the fire. Eating them slowly, you can feel the pace of the room seeping into you. No urgency, no need to be anywhere else. Eventually the boy comes by to collect empty cones, his small hand smelling faintly of charcoal and chestnut skins. The innkeeper nods toward you in thanks, and though no words are spoken, you've been added to the unspoken role of welcome here. When you finally step outside, the air is sharper, cooler, the quiet of the lane a gentle shock after the tavern's hum. You pull your coat a little tighter, the taste of ale still faint on your tongue, and in the distance you hear the faint rhythmic clop of a carriage heading toward the river. And as we follow that sound, let your mind wander to where the Thames runs dark and slow, where a late-night market hums softly under the gaslight, its stalls offering warmth of another kind entirely. The carriage wheels fade into the night, their rhythm replaced by something softer, the low, scattered murmur of voices ahead. As you follow the sound, the air begins to change. It grows cooler, touched with the faint tang of river water, and you catch the mixed scents of damp rope, fresh fish, and roasting nuts drifting together like notes in a chord. The gas lamps here lean slightly toward the street, their glass smudged from years of soot and fog. Pools of yellow light spill onto the cobbles, just enough to reveal the outlines of crates, baskets, and stalls tucked close together like old friends keeping warm. This is the midnight market, an unassuming gathering that's been here, in one form or another, since at least 1854. The official records mention late trade along this stretch of the Thames, but they don't capture its true rhythm. The quiet shuffle of boots on stone, the soft thunk of a knife slicing bread, the clink of bottles being set carefully in a crate. At one stall, a woman in a knitted shawl sells steaming mugs of mulled cider. The drink glows faintly in the lamplight, its surface dappled with floating slices of apple and orange. The steam carries cinnamon, cloves, and just enough nutmeg to make you close your eyes for a moment on the first sip. It warms the throat in a slow, spreading wave, as if the night itself has been coaxed into gentleness. Beside her, a fisherman's table offers small paper parcels of fried whitebait. The fish are crisp, salted just enough, their heat escaping in little wisps when the packet is opened. A man buying a parcel remarks that they're the closest thing to a hot pocket the river can give you. And though you've never heard the phrase before, it feels exactly right. Further along, there's a stall with cheeses under glass domes, each labelled in neat handwriting. A pale, crumbly wedge from Cornwall, a firm, nutty cheddar, and something softer, its surface dusted with ash in the French style. The cheesemonger, a short, round man with a voice like polished oak, offers you a sliver of the cheddar on a small square of bread. The flavour blooms immediately, sharp at first, then mellowing into something almost buttery. The market has its own quiet etiquette, much like the bathhouse or the tavern. Haggling is done with expressions more than words. A raised eyebrow here, a slow nod there, and prices are agreed upon, as if by instinct. No one shouts, no one rushes. Even the few dogs trotting between stalls seem to know this is a place for quiet business. In the centre, where the cobbles widen into a small square, a man with a concertina plays a slow, swaying tune. His case sits open at his feet, a few coins scattered inside, but he doesn't look at them. He plays for the air, for the river, for the people passing through, each note slipping into the fog like it was made for it. You wander from stall to stall, the cider's warmth still in your chest, until you find a baker selling small tarts. They're filled with blackberry preserves so dark they seem almost black, the crust just thick enough to hold the filling without collapsing. The first bite is a pleasant surprise, tart enough to wake you, sweet enough to make you smile. Somewhere nearby, a church bell strikes 2, its sound rolling out over the river. The market doesn't stir. Time moves differently here. You linger a little longer, listening to the soft lap of the Thames against the embankment, the creak of wood as a barge shifts in the current. When at last you leave, the paper parcel of whitebait folded neatly in your pocket for later, the market slips back into shadow behind you, the gas lamps dimming into memory. Ahead, the faint glow of another street calls, one lined with bookshop windows still lit for readers who've lost track of the hour. And as we walk toward that glow, let your mind wander to the scent of paper and ink, and the sound of a page turning slowly, like a breath taken in the dark. The glow ahead is not bright, not urgent, just a steady golden wash spilling from behind a wide window streaked faintly with the condensation of the night. As we step closer, you can see the source, a cluster of oil lamps inside, their flames leaning lazily to one side as if drowsy themselves. Above the door, a wooden sign reads simply, Watling and Son, Booksellers. The lettering is chipped in places, but still proud, like an old gentleman's walking stick. The door itself is unlatched, though the hour is far past closing. Perhaps this is one of those places that keeps its own time. The air inside is a quiet embrace. It smells of leather, ink, and that unmistakable perfume of paper that has known decades. A blend of dust, wood pulp, and faint traces of whatever kitchens, parlours, or ship cabins these books have passed through. The shelves are tall, their tops lost in shadow. Each is filled without any clear regard for category. A slender volume of poetry might be pressed between a weighty history of the Corn Laws and a manual on keeping pigeons. The only sound is the slow, deliberate woof of a page being turned somewhere deeper in the shop. Following it, you find the proprietor, an elderly man in a waistcoat, spectacles perched halfway down his nose, sitting behind a desk piled high with both books and a small plate of butter biscuits. He glances up, offers a nod, then returns to his reading without a word. This seems to be the custom here. Arrivals are acknowledged but not disturbed. There's a small stove in the corner, its metal sides radiating a steady, even heat. On top sits a kettle, a slow hiss escaping from under its lid. A pot of tea rests beside it, the kind that has been brewing long enough to grow dark and strong like liquid oak. Next to it, a chipped mug sits waiting, and without asking, the bookseller gestures for you to help yourself. The tea is deep, almost bitter at first sip, but softened by the sweetness of the biscuit you take from the plate. The sugar in it crunches faintly, like frost underfoot, and the butter leaves a warm richness that lingers long after you swallow. You drift among the shelves, running your fingers along the spines. One, bound in faded green cloth, catches your attention. The title, pressed in gold, Bathing Customs of the English Gentleman. Opening it, you find an 1879 printing, its pages peppered with engravings. Men in elaborate striped bathing costumes, some seated awkwardly on benches, all looking anywhere but at one another. The captions are sparse, almost academic, but there's an odd comfort in their understatement. Near the back of the shop, you discover a small armchair placed in a corner just wide enough to hold it. The cushion is sunken, the fabric worn thin, but it holds you perfectly, as though it's been waiting for you. You read a few passages, sip more tea, and every so often glance toward the bookseller, who is now quietly rearranging a stack of atlases. From somewhere outside comes the faint patter of rain, the soft, irregular kind that seems to make the world smaller and cozier. It taps against the window, then fades, as if deciding not to intrude. Time here feels different. The lamps hum softly, the stove glows, and the only thing marking the passage of minutes is the slow cooling of your tea. When you finally close the bookseller appears at your side, taking it gently and setting it atop a stack. He doesn't ask for payment nor your name, just offers the same small nod as before, as if to say, "You've had enough for tonight." Stepping back out, the air is damp but not cold, the street glistening under the lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whistle sounds, the kind you'd hear from a station platform, and the thought of trains, warm compartments, and padded seats begins to take shape in your mind. And as we follow that thought toward the station, let your mind imagine the soft sway of a carriage and the quiet murmur of fellow travellers heading home. The street narrows before opening onto the station, its great iron roof arching overhead like the ribs of some sleeping giant. The air is rich with the mingled scents of coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of hot tea from a kiosk at the far end. Lamps hang in a neat line, their light catching the drifting wisps of steam that curl up from the waiting engine. This is not the frantic rush of the daytime trains. The midnight service moves at a pace entirely its own, with an air of patience that seems to infect everyone who boards. Even the porters walk more slowly, their boots ringing softly on the platform as they guide trolleys stacked with luggage. You find a carriage near the middle of the train, one of the older ones, its paint dulled, the brass fittings worn to a comfortable glow by thousands of hands. Inside, the compartment smells faintly of polish and warm dust. The seats are upholstered in deep red fabric, the cushions soft enough that you sink in a little, as though the seat itself has decided to keep you for the journey. Through the window, the platform scene drifts by at its own pace. A man in a bowler hat stands under a lamp reading a folded newspaper. A woman in a shawl lifts a wicker basket onto her lap, peeking inside to check the contents. Perhaps bread, perhaps something sweeter. A porter leans on his trolley, watching the steam rise from the engine as if it's telling him a story. The whistle sounds, not sharply, but with a kind of drawn-out sigh, and the train lurches gently into motion. The platform begins to slide away, replaced by the shadowy shapes of warehouses, then the darker line of trees along the edge of the city. Inside, the compartment rocks with a slow, steady rhythm. The sound of the wheels on the rails is a kind of heartbeat. Clack, 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 clack. Regular and soothing. Across from you, an elderly gentleman adjusts his spectacles and opens a small leather-bound notebook. He writes in it slowly, pausing every so often to look out the window, then returns to his neat lines of script. A tea trolley rattles softly past, pushed by a conductor who hums under his breath. You accept a small enamel cup, the tea dark and faintly metallic from the kettle. Alongside it comes a paper-wrapped bun, not overly sweet but rich with currants and a faint dusting of sugar. The warmth from the bun seeps into your fingers, and for a moment you hold it there before taking a bite. Outside, the night deepens. Here and there, the lights of cottages flicker by. Brief, golden glimpses into rooms where fires burn low, and someone may be settling under blankets much like your own at home. The train curves gently, and the faint reflection of your face appears in the glass, layered over the blur of passing hedgerows. Somewhere down the carriage, a muffled laugh drifts through the air, followed by the faint pop of a cork. Not rowdy, just a quiet toast between travellers. A little later, the conductor returns to collect cups, his footsteps soft on the worn carpet. The carriage sways, and the gentle motion, the steady sound of the wheels, and the warmth in your hands all combine into something that feels less like travel and more like being carried. There's no hurry here, no sense of pressing toward the next stop. The train will arrive when it arrives, and until then, the night belongs to its passengers. By the time the train eases into the small riverside station, the burn is gone, the tea a memory. You step down onto the platform, the boards cool under your boots, and watch as the engine breathes out one last sigh of steam before rolling on into the darkness. Ahead, just beyond the station's edge, a path lit by lanterns winds toward the water, and if you follow it, you'll find a boat moored and waiting, its deck lamps swaying in the night breeze. And as we step toward that boat, let your mind feel the gentle rock of the river and the promise of a journey where the current does most of the work. The lanterns along the path are spaced far enough apart that the darkness between them feels almost like stepping through curtains. The air is cooler here, touched with that unmistakable river smell. Part water, part silt, and part something older, as if the Thames itself remembers every story ever told along its banks. The boat waits at the end of a short wooden jetty, its hull painted a deep navy that melts into the night. A rope creaks softly as it shifts against the bollard, and the water below makes a gentle lap against the timbers. The deck lamps swing slightly, casting slow-moving halos of gold over the planks. You step aboard and feel the faint, forgiving give of the wood beneath your feet. The air is warmer here, thanks to a small stove in the cabin, its chimney sending up a lazy thread of smoke into the cool sky. The captain, a man in a thick wool jumper and cap, nods once in greeting and gestures toward a bench along the port side. The bench has a cushion that's seen years of weather, the fabric faded, the stuffing a little uneven, but it molds to your shape instantly, holding you in place as the boat sways gently. You can hear the faint clink of crockery from inside the cabin, and a moment later the captain emerges with 2 enamel mugs. He hands you one without ceremony. The liquid inside is dark and fragrant, a spiced tea, heavy with cloves and a touch of ginger. The first sip is enough to send a slow ribbon of warmth winding down your throat, curling in your stomach. In the distance, the lights of the riverside market glimmer like scattered coins, already growing smaller as the boat begins to drift away from shore. The river's motion is hypnotic. Every so often, the hull meets a slightly larger ripple, and the bench rocks you a little deeper into its embrace. The sound of water against the bow is constant, like a hush meant just for you. Overhead, the sky is a deep, endless velvet, the stars softened by a light mist rising from the water's surface. The captain doesn't speak much, not out of rudeness, but because silence is part of the passage. When he does speak, it's to point out something you might have missed. The faint glow of a heron's eye as it watches from the bank, the ripple of a fish breaking the surface, the soft echo of music from a tavern far inland. Somewhere along the middle of the river, he reaches into a small tin and produces 2 oat cakes. They're plain at first glance, but the first bite reveals a faint sweetness, as if they've been brushed with honey before baking. They're crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, and the perfect companion to the spiced tea still warming your hands. You pass under a low bridge, its stone arches catching and holding the sound of the river so that for a moment it feels louder, fuller, almost like a heartbeat. The light from the lanterns catches on the underside of the arch, making the old stones gleam like wet shells. Past the bridge, the water widens, the banks pull away, and the fog drifts in from both sides until the world feels reduced to just the boat, the water, and the faint glow of the cabin window. The captain adjusts the tiller with one slow movement, and the bow swings toward a quieter stretch where the current is gentler. Eventually, the boat noses up to a small landing barely big enough for 2 people to stand on. The captain ties the rope without hurry, then tips his cap. You step onto the landing, the boards damp underfoot, and watch as the boat eases away again, its lanterns growing fainter until they look like stars floating low on the water. Ahead, a narrow path leads into a cluster of cottages. In one of them, a light still burns, and if you follow that glow, you'll find a kitchen where bread dough is rising under a cloth, and the night is kept warm by the slow work of yeast and thyme. And as we step toward that door, let your mind linger on the scent of fresh bread before it's even baked, the quiet promise of comfort still to come. The path to the cottage is lined with low stone walls, their tops tufted with moss that glows faintly green in the lantern light. The door is half open, and the warm, yeasty air spills into the cool night like a welcome too impatient to wait. Inside, the kitchen is small but arranged with the ease of long use. A single lamp on the table throws its light over a large wooden bowl in which dough rests beneath a flour-dusted cloth. The cloth lifts ever so slightly now and then, as if the dough beneath is breathing in its sleep. The hearth holds a banked fire, its embers glowing low and steady, giving the room a soft heat that seeps into your clothes. A kettle sits to one side, close enough to stay warm without boiling. On a shelf above the hearth, rows of jars catch the lamplight. Cinnamon, dried rosemary, cloves, and a jar labelled simply raisins for winter. The baker, a woman in her 50s with a braid of silver-threaded hair, moves with a kind of deliberate quiet. She stirs something in a pot, milk warming with a stick of cinnamon floating on its surface, and every so often she glances toward the dough as though listening for it to tell her when it's ready. She gestures you to sit at the table where a plate of last night's bread rests, its crust still golden, its interior soft and dotted with small pockets where butter will surely melt. Beside it sits a dish of that butter, pale and curled from being shaped with a wooden paddle. You break a piece of bread, the crust giving with a soft crackle, the crumb releasing a faint cloud of warmth scented faintly of malt. The butter spreads easily, pooling in the little hollows before sinking in. The first bite is a blend of gentle sweetness and salt, the kind of flavour that makes you slow down without realising it. The baker pours you a cup of the warm milk, the cinnamon lending it a deep, almost floral note. The heat of it slips through you in slow, lazy waves, settling somewhere deep in your chest. She doesn't speak, not out of shyness, but because this hour seems to belong to silence. The only sounds are the faint hiss of the fire, the occasional tick of the cooling stove, and the muffled rustle of the cloth as the dough rises a little more. On the wall hangs a small framed clipping from the Illustrated London News, dated January 6th, 1883. It praises the cottage bakery's admirable crust and fine crumb, well suited for the gentleman's breakfast or the workman's supper. In the corner of the clipping, a tiny handwritten note says, "Still the same recipe." After a while, the baker lifts the cloth from the bowl, presses 2 fingers gently into the dough, and nods to herself. She works it with the heel of her hands, the soft thump against the table marking a steady rhythm. You can almost feel the bread's future in each motion, the golden crust, the steam rising from a fresh slice. When she's finished shaping it, she sets the loaves aside to rest again. The lamp flickers once, then steadies. Outside, a light rain begins, pattering softly against the shutters, the sound blending with the slow breathing of the fire. You finish your bread and milk, the warmth making your eyelids feel pleasantly heavy. The baker clears your plate with the same quiet grace she's shown in every movement. Before you leave, she hands you a small cloth bundle, a heel of bread and a square of butter wrapped together, and gives the faintest smile. Stepping back into the night, the rain is cool on your cheeks, but the bundle in your hand is warm, as though it's carrying a piece of the kitchen with it. Down the road, another lamp glows faintly, this one marking the entrance to a tailor's shop where the evening's work has not yet finished. And as we walk toward that shop, let your mind wander to the sound of shears through cloth and the soft whisper of fabric under careful hands. The rain follows you down the lane, tapping softly against your shoulders, until you reach a narrow shop front where the curtains are drawn but the light still glows behind them. The sign above the door, Harland and Company, Tailors, is hand-painted in gold leaf that catches what little lamplight filters through the mist. You push the door gently, and it yields with the faintest creak. Inside, the air smells of pressed wool, cedar, and a faint whiff of machine oil from the treadle sewing machine resting idle in the corner. The warmth is immediate. Not from a roaring fire, but from a small iron stove in the corner, its heat mellowed by hours of steady work. The tailor, Mr. Harland himself, stands behind a long table covered in dark fabric, his spectacles perched low on his nose. He doesn't look up right away. His shears are mid-cut, gliding through the wool with a sound so soft it's almost like paper tearing underwater. Each motion is measured, precise and unhurried, as though the night gives him all the time in the world. Around the shop, jackets hang in neat rows, some finished, others still with chalk marks and basting stitches visible. A few bolts of cloth stand upright in the corner, their muted colours: charcoal, deep green, midnight blue, almost humming in the lamplight. Mr. Harland eventually sets the shears down and offers you a seat on a low stool near the stove. From a drawer beneath the counter, he produces a small tin and opens it to reveal a handful of sugared almonds. Without a word, he tips a few into your palm. They're crisp on the outside, soft and nutty within, a surprising little sweetness in the scent of wool and steam. He returns to his work, pinning a sleeve into place, then threading a needle with silk that gleams in the lamplight. The steady snip, snip of thread being trimmed and the soft scrape of chalk across cloth become a sort of rhythm, one you can feel settling into your bones. On a small shelf above the work table sits an old clock, its hands pointing to midnight. Next to it is a framed trade card from 1876 advertising gentlemen's bathing drawers, cut to preserve decency and comfort. The edges are yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but the print is still clear. You wonder if Mr. Harland had a hand in stitching those, back when the fashion of the bathhouse demanded such care. Every so often he steps to the press, a heavy iron contraption that hisses as it flattens seams into obedience. The scent of warm wool blooms each time, mingling with the faint sweetness of the almonds still on your tongue. Outside, the rain has softened to a mist, and the shop feels even more like a pocket of another world, one where work moves at the pace of thought, and nothing is rushed for the sake of the clock. The longer you sit, the more you notice. The faint sheen on the shears handle from years of use, the way the lamplight softens the creases in Mr. Harland's face, the quiet satisfaction in his movements. When at last he finishes the seam, he folds the jacket carefully, running his hand along it as if smoothing the very air. He places it on the counter, nods once to you, and begins tidying his tools. That's the signal. Not for you to leave, but that this night's work has reached its natural end. You step back into the lane, the mist cool against your face. The bundle of bread from the baker is still warm in your pocket, and now the faint sweetness of almonds joins it. Down the way, a faint orange glow promises the crackle of fire, a glassblower's workshop, still awake long after most of the city sleeps. And as we follow that glow, let your mind picture the shimmer of molten glass and the slow spin of something beautiful taking shape in the dark. The glow ahead wavers, not like lamplight, but with the deep pulsing breath of a living fire. As you draw closer, the cool mist fades, replaced by air that's warmer, drier, and carrying the faint tang of heated metal. The workshop door is half open, the threshold lit in flickers of orange and gold. Inside, the first thing you notice is the sound, a low, steady roar from the furnace, as if the night itself were holding its breath. The floor is swept clean, the benches orderly, but all focus is drawn toward the open mouth of the furnace, its heart white hot, its edges glowing with a dangerous kind of beauty. The glassblower, a broad-shouldered man with soot on his sleeves, moves with surprising gentleness. He withdraws a long metal blowpipe from the furnace, and at its end a molten gather of glass glows like a captured sun. It spins slowly as he turns it, the light shifting over the walls, over his focused expression, over the neat rows of finished work resting on shelves. Those shelves are a quiet marvel, bottles in shades of sea green and amber, bowls with rims as thin as petals, and tiny perfume vials that catch the firelight like drops of water holding the sun. Each one carries a faint shimmer, as though it remembers the heat that shaped it. You take a seat on a low stool near the far wall, where the warmth is steady but not overpowering. The bench beside you holds a small plate with 2 sugared biscuits, no doubt left there by the glassblower's wife. who must know how work like this demands both fuel and quiet encouragement. The biscuits are crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, and just sweet enough to stand against the taste of warm air and faint ash. The glassblower leans into his work, breathing into the pipe with a slow, practiced rhythm. The molten glass swells gently, its surface turning from white to gold to a deep, translucent orange. He rolls it on a steel table, the soft scrape echoing in the warm space, then dips it back into the furnace for another drink of heat. There's a framed newspaper clipping above the workbench dated August 1882, praising the workshop's delicate flasks, much favoured by gentlemen for the holding of colognes and bathing spirits. You imagine those bottles in the bathhouse we visited earlier, resting discreetly beside striped towels and porcelain basins. The process unfolds without haste. Each turn, each breath, each moment back into the furnace is measured. Watching it is like watching a tide roll in and out. The repetition is calming, the outcome inevitable yet beautiful. The glassblower's eyes stay on the piece, but there's no tension in his stance. Just trust in the work and in the fire. When at last he shapes the piece, a small, round vase, its lip flared like the start of a flower, he sets it carefully into a separate oven to cool slowly, safe from the shock of the night air. Only then does he glance your way, lifting his mug from the workbench in a quiet toast before returning it to its place. Outside, the mist has thickened into a soft fog, carrying the faintest scent of the river. The glow of the furnace fades behind you, replaced by the promise of another light ahead, this one pale and steady, spilling from the windows of a late-night apothecary, where shelves of glass jars hold remedies, tonics, and perhaps a sweet or two hidden among the medicine. And as we walk toward that pale light, let your mind wander to the comforting order of jars in a row, each one holding a story in powder, leaf, or liquid form. The fog seems to thin just enough for the apothecary's windows to appear. Tall panes framed by dark wood, each glowing with the kind of pale, steady light that gas lamps give when they've been trimmed with care. The brass bell above the door rings softly as you step inside, its chime more polite than insistent. The air here is a blend of scents that could never be bottled into one note. Camphor, dried lavender, beeswax, and a faint citrus tang that seems to drift from somewhere high on the shelves. Those shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, lined with glass jars labelled in neat looping script. Tinct, valeriana, pulve, glycyrrhizae, flor, chamomile. Between them sit squat bottles of tonics, narrow vials of oils, and small drawers whose contents are known only to the apothecary. He stands behind the counter, tall and thin, his white hair pulled back neatly. A green-shaded lamp casts a pool of light over his workbench, where a set of brass scales waits patiently beside an open ledger. The only other sound is the faint scratching of his pen as he finishes a note before looking up. Without speaking, he gestures toward a jar on the counter. Inside, wrapped in crinkled paper, are lozenges the pale colour of early morning mist. They're honey and horehound, meant to soothe the throat. He nudges the jar forward, inviting you to take one. It's firm at first bite, then slowly softens, releasing a mellow sweetness followed by the faintly herbal taste of the horehound. The apothecary moves to the shelves, selecting jars and weighing their contents with an exactness that feels almost ceremonial. Powder falls into the brass pan with a soft, steady hiss, followed by the slow tipping of dried petals that make the scales balance with the gentlest sway. Each ingredient is placed into a folded paper packet, the corners tucked in as neatly as a letter to a friend. A framed certificate on the wall declares his qualification from 1869, but a smaller frame beside it holds something more personal, a recipe written in a flowing hand, stained faintly with what might be tea. At the bottom, in smaller script, it reads, "Mother's cough syrup. Never failed me yet." The room's stillness is deep but not empty. It's the stillness of a place that holds trust. You notice a wooden cabinet in the corner, its door ajar just enough to reveal shelves of glass bottles in green, brown, and clear, each sealed with wax. Some contain liquids that catch the light in a shimmer. Others hold powders so fine they seem to shift at the smallest breath. He packages a small vial and slides it toward you, though it's unclear whether it's medicine or simply a token. His nod is subtle but certain, a kind of transaction that carries more meaning than coin. As you leave, the bell above the door gives its soft farewell. The fog outside has curled itself tighter around the street, muffling the world into a gentle hush. A faint rhythmic creak draws your attention, the sign of oars dipping into water. Just down a short flight of steps, a small ferry rocks gently at the dock, its lantern glowing like an ember in the mist. And as we walk toward that ferry, let your mind rest on the idea of a crossing made not for speed, but for the pleasure of the slow pull of water beneath you. The steps to the dock are slick with the night's mist, their worn stone edges rounded from decades of footsteps. The river below breathes quietly, its surface broken only by the slow dip and rise of two oars, their blades catching what little light the ferry's lantern offers. The lantern swings slightly with the motion of the water, painting the inside of the mist with a warm, shifting glow. The ferryman is a stout man in a wool coat, his cap pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. He greets you not with words, but with a brief tilt of his chin, the kind that carries both welcome and understanding. You step aboard, the wooden planks giving a faint creak and the ferry rocks just enough to remind you it's alive underfoot. The benches are bare wood, smooth from years of passengers, fishermen with early catches, merchants with baskets, couples heading home from late suppers. Tonight, though, you have one almost to yourself, save for a woman wrapped in a shawl on the far end, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of the opposite bank. The ferryman pushes off with one sure motion, the oars dipping into the water with a soft swish. The current takes some of the work, pulling you gently downstream as the mist closes in just enough to turn the world into a small drifting bubble. The river's smell is earthy, edged with salt from tides that still reach this far inland. Every stroke of the oars is deliberate, unhurried. The only other sound is the occasional soft clunk as the wooden hull nudges a ripple, the water lapping back against it in answer. Somewhere nearby, hidden in the fog, comes the faint call of a night bird. The ferryman pauses briefly to pour himself a drink from a small flask, then offers it your way. It's not spirits, but something softer. Warm cider with a hint of nutmeg. The heat spreads through you, and you notice the shawled woman on the other bench has closed her eyes, letting the motion of the ferry carry her like a cradle. Halfway across, the mist parts for a moment, revealing the lights of a riverside tavern, their reflections trembling on the water like small fires. The ferryman doesn't turn toward it, though. His route is steady, as if the other side is less a destination and more a suggestion. By the time you think you've reached the far bank, you realize you're not quite sure where the starting shore has gone. The mist makes each bank look like the other, soft and undefined. The ferry drifts in a slow arc and then, without the faintest bump, it kisses the side of a wooden jetty you hadn't seen until you were already there. The ferryman steadies the boat with one hand, nods again, and gestures toward the dock. You step off onto the slick boards, the air here carrying a faint whiff of baking, something rich, spiced, and almost certainly fresh from an oven. A narrow lane winds upward from the jetty, its stones glistening in the lantern light. At the top sits a low, wide building with a crooked sign swinging above the door, its paint faded but still legible, the Ginger Biscuit. And as we climb toward that warm doorway, let your mind rest on the thought of a pastry still warm enough to steam when broken open, the scent rising like a promise into the night air. The door to the Ginger Biscuit swings inward with a sigh, letting out a wave of warmth that instantly erases the river chill from your skin. The air inside is thick with the scent of molasses, ground ginger, and something buttery that clings to the walls as much as to the pastries cooling on wire racks. The space is small, more a baker's front room than a true shop, with a counter running along one side and a single table in the corner where the regulars seem to have claimed permanent residence. A great copper kettle hangs above the hearth, steam curling lazily from its spout, and beside it sits a stone jar of honey, its lid polished smooth by years of use. Behind the counter, the baker, a round-cheeked man with a moustache so well kept it could have its own calling card, is pulling a tray from the oven. The biscuits on it are deep gold, their edges slightly darker, their tops cracked just enough to let the steam escape in tiny fragrant clouds. He sets the tray down and slides one toward you on a square of paper, the kind that rustles softly when you move it. You take the biscuit in both hands. It's still warm enough that the heat pools in your palms. The first bite is a small shock of spice, ginger sharp enough to wake you for a moment, followed by the mellow sweetness of dark sugar, the richness of butter, and a faint, pleasing crunch at the edges. Inside it's soft, almost cake-like, the kind of texture that makes you think of rain tapping gently against a window. The regulars glance up just long enough to nod before returning to their mugs. One of them is cradling a small glass of dark ale, another a steaming cup of tea strong enough to tint the air around it. On the table sits a plate of biscuits identical to yours, slowly disappearing as the night drifts by. On the wall above the counter hangs a yellowed recipe card, written in looping, confident script. The date in the corner reads October 1875, and beneath the ingredients is a single line: "Bake until the room smells of home." You can't help but think the instruction has been followed perfectly tonight. The baker offers you a cup of tea to go with your biscuit, black tea mellowed with a spoonful of honey from the jar near the fire. The honey's sweetness mingles with the ginger's heat in a way that lingers long after each sip, as if the flavours have agreed to walk you home. Somewhere in the corner a clock ticks in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound blends with the faint crackle of the hearth and the occasional soft thud of another tray being set on the counter. Time here feels strange. The outside world could be racing ahead, but within these walls it moves like treacle in winter, each moment stretching just enough to be savoured. By the time you finish, the warmth has settled deep into your chest, and the paper that once held your biscuit is soft from the heat it carried. The baker wraps 2 more in paper and slips them into your coat pocket without a word, a gesture that feels like parting advice. Outside, the mist has thinned, revealing a narrow street that slopes downward toward a cluster of houses with light still in their upper windows. From somewhere ahead comes the faint rhythmic knock of wood on wood, the unmistakable sound of someone working late at a cooper's shop, shaping staves for barrels that will hold the next season's ale. And as we follow that sound, let your mind picture the smooth curve of oak under skilled hands and the scent of fresh wood shavings curling in the lamplight. The sound grows clearer as you follow the slope of the street. A hollow tock, 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 steady as a heartbeat. The glow ahead is softer than a tavern's light, warmer than a street lamp flickering gently against the mist. The cooper's shop is a low, wide building with its double doors propped open, the night air mixing with the scent inside. Fresh oak, pitch, and the faint tang of linseed oil. Shavings curl across the floor in pale spirals, catching the lamplight like ribbons. Inside, the cooper, a broad man with sleeves rolled past his elbows, is fitting iron hoops around the belly of a half-finished barrel. The oak staves curve gracefully, their surfaces sanded smooth but still carrying the faint, sweet scent of the forest they came from. Each time he taps the hoop into place, the sound rings out like a muted bell. The benches are cluttered with tools, draw knives with handles worn smooth, mallets with heads darkened from years of use, and a great compass resting open beside a stack of cut staves. Against one wall, completed barrels stand in neat ranks, their sides glowing faintly from a final polish of oil. He notices you, nods, and sets his mallet aside. From a shelf above the workbench, he takes down a small jug and 2 clay cups. The liquid he pours is amber and smells faintly of apples, cider pressed from the last autumn's crop. It's cool, with a soft sweetness that rolls across the tongue, and the cooper sets a small plate of oat biscuits beside it, as if to anchor the moment. The warmth of the shop isn't from a stove, but from the work itself. The constant motion, the rhythm of fitting and tightening, the breath that rises with each measured strike. The light shifts across the curves of the wood, showing the subtle seams where staves meet so perfectly they seem like a single piece. On a beam above the door hangs a painted board from 1881, commemorating the shop's largest commission, 40 barrels bound for a brewery in Southwark. The lettering is hand-done, a little uneven, but the pride in it is unmistakable. The cooper returns to his work, drawing a hoop down into place with a slow turn of a hammer. The ring of metal on metal is deep, almost musical, and it echoes in the quiet room until it fades into the softer sounds of the night outside. When the last hoop is in place, he runs his hands over the barrel surface, checking for any whisper of a gap. Satisfied, he tips it onto its side and it rolls across the floor with a low, perfect hum. You step back into the cool air, the scent of oak and cider still clinging faintly to your coat. Down the street you hear a different rhythm, the crisp, precise click of boot heels on stone and the occasional rustle of cloth. A tailor's mannequin in a shop window turns in the lamplight, hinting at a dressmaker's studio that's still awake. And as we follow that sound toward the shop, let your mind picture satin and thread moving under quick, skilled fingers and the quiet pleasure of a garment taking shape stitch by stitch. The dressmaker's shop sits at the corner where two narrow streets meet, its windows tall and arched, the glass slightly wavy from age. Tonight the curtains are half drawn, but enough light spills through to catch the gleam of a silk dress suspended on a mannequin, its hem lifted just enough to suggest motion. The door opens without protest, the small bell above it chiming in a tone more silver than brass. Inside the air is warm, faintly perfumed with lavender sachets tucked between bolts of fabric. The scent is softened by the aroma of starch and pressed cloth, the kind that carries both freshness and precision. The dressmaker, a woman in her 40s, hair pinned in a tidy knot, sits at a large oak table in the centre of the room. A length of pale blue satin spills across it like still water, and her fingers move along the seam with the practiced certainty of someone who could sew in complete darkness if she had to. She glances up briefly, offering a smile that's quick but genuine, then gestures toward a low chair beside a small side table. There, a pot of chamomile tea sits beneath a knitted cosy, its steam curling upward in slow, graceful spirals. Next to it is a plate of almond macaroons, golden on top, slightly chewy in the middle with a dusting of sugar that clings to your fingertips. The room feels like a library of fabric. Shelves hold rolls of cloth in deep jewel tones, muted tweeds and delicate florals, each stacked with their selvages facing outward like well-kept spines. A small wooden chest near the wall is open to reveal trays of buttons, pearl, brass, carved wood, each one catching the lamplight in a different way. On the far wall hangs a framed advertisement clipped from the Lady's Pictorial, dated April 1884, proclaiming "Custom bathing gowns, cut for elegance and modesty." The illustration shows a figure standing by a bathing machine, her gown a sweep of stripes and careful pleats. The dressmaker chuckles softly when she notices you looking at it, as though remembering the particular fuss that order caused. She returns to her stitching, the sound of the needle passing through fabric barely audible over the soft tick of a clock in the corner. Every so often she leans back, holding the seam up to the light to check its straightness, then resumes with the same unhurried rhythm. When she pauses to sip her tea, she offers you another macaroon, the sugar melting almost instantly on your tongue. The chamomile tea is floral and calming, the sort that settles the body and slows the thoughts without asking. By the time she finishes the seam, the hem of the dress falls perfectly even all around, the blue satin rippling faintly with each movement. She drapes it over the mannequin with a single fluid gesture, and for a moment it almost looks like the dress is breathing. The bell above the door gives a soft farewell as you step out again, the street now quieter than before. Ahead, the faint glow of lamplight spills from a narrow alley, accompanied by the dry, papery rustle of pages. It's the sound of a printer's workshop still at work, the presses turning like a slow, steady heartbeat. And as we follow that glow toward the press, let your mind picture rows of type neatly set in frames, ink rolling over paper, and the satisfaction of a freshly printed sheet still warm to the touch. The alley narrows until the cobblestones feel close underfoot, the mist pressed in on both sides. The glow at its end comes not from a single lamp, but from several oil lights placed high on the walls, their flames steady and practical. As you step closer, the smell reaches you first, a mix of warm ink, paper, and the faint tang of metal like a handful of coins warmed in your palm. The printer's workshop is larger than it first appears, the front door opening into a space where the ceiling disappears into shadow. Along the walls, tall racks hold trays of type, each compartment filled with tiny metal letters standing neatly in rows. The presses themselves sit in the center, heavy cast-iron machines with broad levers, flywheels and rollers that gleam faintly with ink. The printer, a wiry man in shirt sleeves with a streak of black across one cheek, is leaning over a freshly pulled sheet. He doesn't look up right away, his eyes scanning for smudges or uneven lines. Satisfied, he sets it aside and places another blank page in the frame. You take a seat on a bench near the back wall, where a small brazier gives off a gentle heat. On the table beside it sits a pot of tea that's been steeping long enough to turn nearly black, accompanied by a tin of shortbread biscuits cut into neat rectangles. They're crisp, buttery, and leave a faint trace of sugar at the corners of your mouth. The rhythm of the press is hypnotic, the slow turn of the flywheel, the soft shift as paper meets ink, the solid thunk as the lever comes down. Between each motion there's a pause, not long enough for impatience, just enough for the ink to settle. The printer moves like part of the machine, each step practiced, each reach for a sheet or a tray of type as smooth as breathing. On the far wall, a large calendar from 1885 hangs, its dates crossed neatly in red pencil. A small note in the corner reads, "Bathhouse Etiquette Pamphlet, second run due Thursday." You wonder how many of those have passed through these presses, their pages folded into neat stacks for gentlemen to read on their way to the steam rooms. The printer pours 2 cups of tea without asking, sliding one toward you with fingers still faintly stained in black. The tea is strong, earthy, with a depth that lingers, pairing perfectly with the last bite of shortbread you let dissolve slowly on your tongue. Nearby, a young apprentice sorts small blocks of type back into their trays, the faint tick of metal on metal like the counting of distant coins. The smell of ink rises each time a roller passes over the plate, blending with the faint woody scent of the tea. When the last sheet is pulled and placed to dry, the printer wipes his hands on a cloth, nods toward the open door, and says only, "Night's work done." His voice is soft, but it carries the quiet satisfaction of something completed well. Outside, the alley feels cooler, the mist touched with the faintest metallic note from the presses. Down the street, past a shuttered cafe and a row of sleeping houses, there's the glimmer of another open doorway and the faint unmistakable smell of sugar beginning to caramelize. A confectioner's kitchen is still awake, working through the last batch of the night. And as we walk toward that scent, let your mind picture copper pots and wooden spoons, and the slow golden swirl of sugar turning into something worth waiting for. The scent draws you before the doorway comes into view, rich, deep, and just shy of burnt, like the very edge of a perfect toffee. The windows of the confectioner's kitchen glow softly against the dark street, and as you step inside, the air wraps around you with a gentle, sticky warmth. The room is long and narrow, with copper pots gleaming along one wall, each one suspended from a hook polished by decades of use. The far end is occupied by a wide marble slab, its surface dusted with a fine scatter of powdered sugar that catches the lamplight in pale sparkles. At the centre, the confectioner, a tall, spare man in a linen apron, is leaning over a pot. He stirs with a wooden spoon in slow, deliberate circles, the molten sugar inside catching the light like a swirl of amber glass. The smell is hypnotic, caramel, butter, and the faint bite of lemon zest added somewhere in the early stages. Without a word, he gestures toward a small table where a plate of sugared fruit jellies rests. They're cut into neat cubes, their colours muted in the lamplight, pale gold, soft rose, and a green so delicate it seems to vanish at the edges. You pick one up, the sugar crunching faintly between your fingers, and bite. It yields instantly, melting into a burst of pear and something floral, like eating the memory of an orchard in summer. The confectioner pours the caramel onto the marble slab, the hot stream pooling and spreading with a soft hiss as it meets the cooler surface. He works it with a pair of long-handled paddles, folding and lifting in a rhythm that is part muscle, part memory. The air grows richer with every turn, and the sheen on the surface deepens until it looks like it might hold the lamplight forever. On a shelf above the marble sits a glass jar labelled November 1881 for bathhouse. Inside are small pale mints, each stamped with a tiny motif of crossed towels. You can imagine them offered discreetly after a gentleman's steam, a polite nod to both refreshment and tradition. Once the caramel reaches the right stage, he begins cutting it into neat squares, each one cooling into a soft chew. He offers you one still warm enough to bend slightly in your fingers. The flavour blooms in stages, first sweet, then buttery, then a whisper of salt that lingers long after the bite is gone. A clock on the wall ticks past 1 in the morning. The confectioner works without hurry, stacking the cooled pieces into tins lined with paper. Between each layer, he sprinkles a dusting of fine sugar like fresh snow falling in slow motion. When the tins are full, he closes them with a quiet snap of the lid and sets them aside. He pours 2 cups of cocoa from a pot at the back of the stove. Dark, thick, and just sweet enough to balance the bitterness. The heat of it hums through you, soft and steady, until the night outside feels gentler than before. When you step out again, the street is still and the mist has softened to a silvery veil. Farther along, a faint rhythmic creak comes from the direction of the wharf. The sound of a night watchman making his rounds, lantern swinging, boots pacing their patient patrol. And as we follow that steady light toward the water, let your mind wander to the comfort of someone keeping watch while the rest of the city sleeps. The wharf appears slowly through the mist, its timbers slick and dark from the night air. The faint lap of water against the pilings is joined by the low groan of a rope, tightening somewhere in the darkness. Between the stacks of barrels and crates, a lantern swings in a steady arc, its light cutting thin slices through the fog. The watchman moves with a rhythm born of repetition, boots striking the boards in a measured pace, lantern in one hand, a short staff in the other. His coat is heavy wool, the shoulders darkened by years of weather, and his scarf is wrapped high enough that only his eyes are visible. They crinkle slightly as he nods in greeting, his steps never breaking. He pauses at the end of the wharf, setting the lantern down on a bollard so its glow pools over the slick wood. From his coat pocket, he produces a small paper packet and unfolds it to reveal oat biscuits studded with dried currants. He offers you one before taking one for himself, biting into it with the slow satisfaction of someone who knows the value of chewing in the quiet. The biscuit is firm, the currants sweet, and the faint salt in the air makes every bite more vivid. A gust of wind carries the scent of tar and hemp rope, mingling with the softer aroma of coal smoke drifting from somewhere upriver. As the watchman resumes his walk, you follow at a distance, the boards beneath your boots echoing faintly in the open air. Every so often he stops to check a mooring, leaning his weight into a rope before moving on. The lantern's glow pools briefly over the water, revealing flashes of ripples that vanish into the dark. On the far side of the wharf, a small shelter stands with its door propped open. Inside is a bench, a small brazier glowing with a handful of coals, and a battered enamel kettle resting on the grate. He pours 2 cups of tea from it, strong, dark, and flavoured faintly with whatever leaves were last in the tin. The warmth seeps through the metal cup into your hands, the heat steady against the cool of the night. Pinned to the wall of the shelter is a faded notice dated February 1880. Gentlemen using the riverside baths are reminded to keep within designated swimming boundaries. The paper is curled at the edges, the ink just beginning to blur, but the words still stand clear, a remnant of the same current of etiquette that runs through all the places we've visited tonight. The watchman finishes his tea in 3 unhurried swallows, sets the cup back on the bench and lifts his lantern again. His next patrol will carry him toward the far pier, and you, stepping back onto the cobblestones, follow the glow of another light entirely, this one bright and steady in a shop window displaying neatly arranged pies under a bell jar. And as we head toward that inviting window, let your mind wander to the comfort of pastry crust breaking under your fork, and the scent of filling rising with each bite. The shop's window is a small stage in the night, its glow cutting a neat square into the mist. Inside, under a glass bell jar that's slightly fogged from the heat within, sits a perfect pie. The crust is golden and just uneven enough to prove it was made by hand, with 1 or 2 spots where the filling has bubbled up and glazed the edge. The doorbell gives a soft ring as you step inside, releasing a wave of warm air scented with butter, pepper, and the slow-cooked depth of meat and vegetables melded together. The counter is short and worn smooth from years of elbows and coins sliding across it. Behind it stands the shopkeeper, a stout woman with quick eyes and an apron that's seen better days but has never failed her. Without asking your order, she takes a slice from the pie under the bell jar and sets it on a small plate, the crust flaking as her knife moves through it. Steam escapes in a fragrant curl. Beef, onions, a hint of thyme, and something richer. Perhaps ale reduced until it's thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. The slice lands before you on the counter with a quiet thud, accompanied by a fork and a small jar of mustard. The pastry crumbles under the tines, the filling spilling onto the plate in a slow, generous heap. The first bite is everything the scent promised. Savoury, warming, and layered with flavours that seem to have been patiently waiting for this moment. A pot of tea steams beside the till, and the shopkeeper pours you a cup without ceremony. It's plain, strong, and exactly what's needed to balance the richness of the pie. A plate of pickled onions appears beside you as well, their sharpness cutting neatly through the buttery crust. The only sounds in the shop are the faint hiss of the oven behind the counter and the slow tick of a clock mounted high on the wall. Its hands point to nearly 2 a.m, yet there's no sense of hurry here, only the quiet assurance that if someone needed a pie at this hour, it would be ready for them. On a shelf above the counter sits a dusty clipping from the Morning Post, dated May 1882. It praises the hearty yet refined pies offered to gentlemen returning from the river baths. A faded ink note in the margin reads, "Same recipe still. Why change?" By the time your plate is clean, the glass over the pie is cleared just enough for you to see another slice missing, claimed by a man in a bowler hat at the far end of the counter. The shopkeeper slides your empty plate away, gives a small nod, and returns to tending the oven. Outside, the street is quieter still. The mist has thinned into a low drift, letting you see the faint glow of lamplight in the windows of a small lodging house at the corner. From within comes the gentle clink of china and the faint, comforting murmur of late-night conversation, perhaps the final stop before sleep truly takes hold. And as we walk toward that lamplit door, let your mind rest on the sound of cutlery in a warm dining room and the promise of a bed waiting just upstairs. The door to the lodging house opens with the smallest groan like a tired man settling into a chair. Inside, the air is warm but not heavy, holding the faint mingling scents of tea, polished wood, and a trace of coal smoke drifting in from a grate somewhere deeper inside. The dining room sits just off the entry hall, its door propped open with a brass weight shaped like a sleeping cat. Light spills across the carpet from a pair of oil lamps on the sideboard, catching the edges of mismatched china cups and the gleam of spoons resting in saucers. At the far wall, a tall clock presides over the room. Its pendulum swings with a slow, deliberate arc, each tick steady enough to make you feel as if time has loosened its grip here. The rest of the room moves to its rhythm. Conversations rise and fall between ticks, spoons stir tea between tocks. A handful of guests linger at the tables. An older couple share a plate of thinly sliced fruitcake, passing the fork between them without a word. At another table, a young clerk in shirt sleeves writes a letter in a looping hand, pausing now and then to sip his tea and glance at the clock as if for approval. The hostess appears from the kitchen with a tray bearing a teapot, a small jug of cream and a plate of currant scones. She sets them before you with a smile that asks no questions, then disappears again into the warm shadows. The scone breaks apart easily, its crumbs soft and flecked with fruit. Spread with a little butter and a dab of strawberry jam, it melts into a perfect blend of sweet and tart, softened further by a sip of tea that's been steeped just long enough to bloom but not to bite. On the mantel above the fireplace sits a row of small framed sketches, ships, landscapes, and one of a riverside bathhouse. The steam rising from its roof, rendered in quick, affectionate strokes. A faint note in pencil along the edge reads, June 1884. Quiet day but warm water. The conversation in the room remains hushed, the clink of cutlery and the slow turn of pages in a book forming a kind of lullaby. The clock ticks on, steady and certain, its hands moving toward an hour when only the most determined night owls remain awake. When your cup is empty and the last crumbs have vanished from your plate, the hostess returns to clear the table. She nods toward the staircase in the hall, where the soft glow of a single gas lamp guides the way upward. Outside, the air has cooled further, the mist barely clinging to the cobbles. Down the street, another door stands open, light spilling out onto the steps, accompanied by the faint, irregular notes of a piano. Someone is playing late into the night, each chord lingering just a little too long, as if reluctant to fade. And as we walk toward that music, let your mind follow the sound of the keys, each one a stepping stone toward the very end of the night's wander. The music drifts into the street like candlelight spilling under a door, soft, flickering, and carrying the shape of the player's thoughts. The open doorway leads into a narrow hall lined with coats and hats, the air inside holding the faint perfume of tobacco, polished wood, and rain-damp wool. The room beyond is small, but the piano commands it entirely. Its polished mahogany case reflects the lamplight, and its ivory keys have the faint yellowing of years' worth of evenings like this one. The pianist, a man in his 60s with silver hair combed neatly back, sits with his shoulders slightly curved, his head tilted toward the notes as though listening to a story being told just out of reach. Around the room, a few chairs are occupied by listeners leaning forward with elbows on knees, their cups of tea or small glasses of sherry held lightly in their hands. The music is not loud, nor is it hurried. Each phrase unfolds as if the night itself is waiting patiently for the next. You find a seat near the back, where the piano's sound is warm but mellowed by distance. On a side table beside you sits a plate of small butter biscuits, their edges browned just enough to hint at a faint crispness. One bite is all it takes to discover they dissolve almost instantly, leaving only a trace of butter and a whisper of vanilla. The piece changes, a waltz now, but slowed so much it feels more like the sway of a boat than a dance. The chords seem to hum in the wood of the piano, and you can almost see the vibrations in the lamplight trembling across the polished lid. Outside, rain begins again, pattering softly against the window in a rhythm that folds itself into the music. On the wall above the piano hangs a framed program from an 1883 concert at a riverside hall. In the margin, written in a careful hand, is the note, "Played for the bathhouse patrons after closing, a quieter audience than usual." The pianist's hands move with the ease of long familiarity, the melody spilling forward until it seems to forget itself, pausing in a chord that lingers in the air long enough to make everyone in the room hold still. Then, without ceremony, the music begins to fade, slower, softer, until the last note drops into the quiet like a pebble into a deep pool. No one claps. Instead, there's a collective exhale, the kind that comes when a moment has been fully lived and can now be left to rest. The pianist nods once, closes the full board over the keys, and rises to pour himself a final cup of tea. You finish your biscuit, letting the last sweetness fade as you step back into the night. The rain is light, more a mist now, and the streets are empty except for the faint glimmer of lamplight pooling around the corners. The city is asleep, but the memory of its warmth in steam, in bread, in tea, and music lingers like the last chord of the piano, humming quietly in your chest. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. If you drifted off somewhere along this walk, let me know below. Sweet dreams, stories that make you sleep, signing off.